Grace and peace to you in the name of the God the Creator, Christ the Redeemer, and the Spirit who sustains us. Amen. So here you are again. How many bumper stickers can this car possibly have? Do they just keep multiplying or what? But this one may just take the cake. This one says, "Love the sinner, hate the sin." Well, I'm sure you all have no trouble imagining what I think about this one. After all, the most common application of this saying is in regards to LGBTQIA plus people. Many people trace this back to St. Augustine, who wrote, "With love for humankind and hatred of sins," which is a similar concept, but not identical. There are even people who believe that this phrase originated with Jesus. Spoiler alert, Jesus never said this. Instead, Jesus said, "Don't judge." This phrase, "love the sinner, hate the sin," has been a pretty popular phrase in conservative evangelical Christian circles for a few decades now, and there's a reason for that. It's easy to argue that when you say you love the sinner but hate the sin, you're doing exactly what Jesus wants us to do. You're loving people and praying that they live more fully into who God intends them to be. And there are probably even people who embrace the love the sinner, hate the sin attitude who really, truly, honestly believe that's what they're doing. But it's not. Love the sinner, hate the sin has some implied judgment built in, doesn't it? It's an "I love you, but" statement. I love you, but I wish you got better grades. I love you, but I don't think you should talk back so much. I love you, but I just can't condone your lifestyle. That last one's my favorite interpretation, by the way. It always makes me wish someone would say it to me so that I can ask them what's so bad about paying our bills on time, putting reasonably healthy meals on the table most of the time, and watching TV together in the evenings. Do you hear what the "but" does in those "I love you, but" sentences? It modifies how much love is offered. I love you, but I could love you more if you would only get better grades, stop talking back, become a different person. And that's where this phrase is so insidious. But first, let's go back to Jesus for a moment. As I pointed out, Jesus never said, "Love the sinner, hate the sin." And then I followed that up with a verse, Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, in which Jesus comes out pretty strongly against judging someone. But our text for this morning is just a few verses further on in Matthew. And as we know from those texts, don't judge, or from those verses, don't judge isn't as easy as not judging. Judgment is going to happen. So how do we contextualize what it means not to judge? How do we understand what it means to take the 2x4 out of our own eyes before trying to remove the splinter from our neighbor's eye? There's something theologians like to do, which we call letting Jesus interpret Jesus. So what does Jesus mean when he says, "Don't judge"? And if you have to judge, address your own vision before you address your neighbor's. Let's look to 3 verses from Matthew chapter 18. These verses should be familiar to you. In fact, we talked about these verses when we redid our Constitution. Listen to what Jesus says about judging. "If your sibling should commit some wrong against you, go and point out the error. but keep it between the two of you. If they listen to you, you've won a loved one back. If not, try again, but take one or two others with you so that every case may stand on the word of 2 or 3 witnesses. If your sibling refuses to listen to them, refer the matter to the church. If they ignore even the church, then treat that sibling as you would treat a Gentile or a tax collector. In other words, if you're having a problem with someone, take someone else along to listen to both sides and make sure that you are not trying to see them through this giant 2x4 that's blocking your ability to accurately assess what's going on. And if that doesn't resolve it, there could be a couple of different reasons. Either no resolution is possible, or you chose people who are going to take your side and not play fair with the other person. There's a good reason that Jesus used the eye as an analogy in today's text from Matthew 7. The eye represents more than just what we see. It also represents what we observe and what we perceive. Observation and perception are more than just seeing or hearing or feeling or however it is that we obtain information from the world around us. At its basic level, sight happens, seeing happens when light hits our retinas, turns into electrical impulses, and is turned into images in our brain. But observation is more than that. To observe is to make note of something. That moves beyond seeing. When we were in Eureka Springs a few weeks ago, we walked into a restaurant for breakfast. I saw that there was a party seated at a table near the door, but I didn't really observe them. I wasn't paying attention. I was thinking about where we were going to sit. Until something caught my eye about the man at the table. I looked at him a little more closely, and I observed that he and I had on matching Chiefs t-shirts. It's a trivial example, but an apt one. Had his t-shirt not caught my eye, I might have been able to tell you later in the day that there were 3 people sitting at that table having breakfast. Or I might not have. But once I observed his t-shirt, they stopped just being part of the background scenery and became people that I saw and could form an opinion on. And of course, my opinion was that he had on a really cool t-shirt. And I told him so. But it wasn't significant. It didn't markedly improve my day or make it worse to see that that man being my t-shirt twin. And perception is a step beyond observation. To perceive something is to observe it and to register it as significant. I've formed a habit when I'm driving in bad weather or if I end up in a traffic jam, especially on the highway. If I'm driving significantly slower than most people would reasonably expect traffic to normally flow on that stretch of a highway, whether it's because of decreased visibility or because the entire line of traffic is slowed down, I put my hazard lights on. Most drivers perceive hazard lights as indicating an increased need for caution. And so using my hazard lights increases my safety and the safety of those around me. It's more than just an observation that traffic might be slowing down. The flashing lights indicate a potential danger. So when Jesus uses the metaphors of splinters and 2x4s in people's eyes, he's talking about the way we see our neighbors, the way we observe our neighbors, and the way we perceive our neighbors. Who do we see as just extras in our lives, like on a movie set? Who do we observe? What causes us to take notice of a person or of a trait or characteristic about them? And what do we see that we judge as significant? And are we right to judge that as significant? Siblings in Christ, when we talk about phrases like love the sinner, hate the sin, we're not talking about love. We're not talking about sin. We're not even talking about forgiveness or grace, and we're certainly not talking about God. We're talking about bias. We're talking about the blind spots that prevent us from seeing someone else's true worth as a child of God. We're talking about homophobia. We're talking about ageism. We're talking about racism, about blanket judgments about poor people or people with any type of chronic illness, physical or mental, or about people who are from the South or Afghanistan or China. Because I have never heard love the sinner, hate the sin applied to people who choose to make their living as corporate raiders or con artists or cat burglars. I've never heard it applied to people who cheat on their taxes or lie to get ahead at work. I've never applied it to decisions that people make, sinful actions that people willingly engage in, things that can harm another person. Maybe you have, but I haven't. Every time I have heard it applied to people on the margins, people whose identities, whether that identity is LGBTQIA+, too old or too young, not white, living with some kind of diagnosis, whatever it may be. People whose identities mark them as other, less than. Matthew was written for people on the margins, for people like me. This gospel was written specifically to Christians in Antioch who were outside the socio-political, economic, and religious mainstream, which was based on the assumption that Rome can and should rule the world. And who is Rome today? White, straight, cisgender, middle and upper middle class. The rules are written for people who fall into these categories. Now, that's not to say that the gospel is not written for white, straight, cisgender, middle, and upper middle class people. Of course it is. The gospel is for everyone. But what that means is that those of us who have privilege need to take time to examine our biases, take the 2x4 out of our own eyes before we judge someone as sinful just because they aren't like us. Now, I'm pretty lucky. I fit most of the categories. I'm white. I was born into the same gender with which I identify, and we are middle to upper middle class. I am well educated, and I can speak up for myself. But I can also speak into the margins. As a lesbian, as a person who doesn't fit into the straight category, I can tell you that there's a certain amount of internal tension that exists when we try to live both in the larger culture, the Rome of middle-class suburban America, and also try to honor my identity as a lesbian, a wife to Rebecca, a mom to our kids. For me, that amount of tension is pretty low, mostly unnoticeable. But sometimes it rears its head. And usually when it does, it's one of those moments where I feel like I'm on the receiving end of love the sinner, hate the sin kinds of attitudes. Because, Pastor Burt Montgomery wrote, the problem with love the sinner, hate the sin is that the second part always gets in the way of the first part. Amen.